She had always thought of herself as background, the quiet presence who carried extra supplies, poured water into canteens, checked bandages, and passed messages when the wind carried voices away, but the ridge had a way of reminding people that even those in the background were standing closer to history than they realized. The ridge stretched long and bare beneath a sky that seemed to hang heavy with waiting silence, its rocks sharp and unforgiving, its soil stained with the tired footprints of soldiers who had come before. She was stationed there not as a fighter but as support, the kind of role that made her invisible to most eyes. The men and women around her were hardened, rifles slung across their shoulders, eyes sharp as the hawks that circled above. She kept her distance, blending into the canvas tents and crates stacked against the slope, her hands always busy with small tasks that seemed to matter little compared to the thunder of artillery in the valley below. Yet she listened. She always listened. Every shout, every muttered plan, every hurried step taught her the rhythm of life on the ridge, a rhythm built on anticipation, exhaustion, and the eerie calm that came in the hours between battles. At night, when the air turned cold and the lanterns flickered in the wind, she would sit alone with her thoughts, fingers running over the worn strap of the satchel she carried. That satchel held nothing extraordinary: gauze, iodine, scraps of paper, a whistle, and a cracked mirror she used to catch signals from across the valley. To anyone else it was a pouch of trivial things, but to her it was survival itself, the symbol of her place on the ridge. She was not meant to fight, not meant to kill, not meant to lead charges or make decisions that carved into maps. She was meant to observe, to heal, to remind others that even in the heart of war, small acts of care still mattered. The commanders never looked her in the eye, and the soldiers rarely remembered her name, but she accepted that with quiet grace. She told herself that history was written by the ones who stood tall with rifles, and her role was only to hold the ink well steady while the words were scratched onto the page. Yet the ridge carried whispers of inevitability. There was something in the way the wind swept across it, tugging at coats and stirring dust into spirals, as though the land itself knew that one moment could tilt everything into chaos. She often thought of that as she watched the horizon, where the mountains cut sharp against the dawn and smoke rose faint from distant fires. She imagined the invisible threads of fate stretching across those hills, binding people she had never met to choices they had not yet made. Sometimes she wondered whether her own thread was even strong enough to be seen, or if she was nothing more than a shadow on the edge of someone else's story. But the longer she remained on the ridge, the more she felt it pulling, tugging her closer to some unknown point that waited ahead like a storm no one could outrun. The men joked that she was like a ghost, drifting through the camp with her soft footsteps and quiet eyes. She learned to laugh with them when they teased her for never raising her voice or for always carrying that satchel as though it were a weapon of its own. They did not know that she studied them when they weren't looking, memorizing the way they tightened straps, the way they scanned the ridges for movement, the way they hardened themselves before dawn patrols. She collected details the way others collected tokens from home, as if by understanding them she could piece together the larger puzzle of survival. There was comfort in knowing their routines, in predicting who would reach for the canteen first or who would pause to tie a bootlace even in the middle of a march. The predictability made her feel safe, even as the war shifted constantly beyond the ridge. But safety was fragile. It was an illusion built on repetition, and repetition could be shattered in a single instant. She knew this, yet she clung to the rhythm all the same. In the early mornings she woke before the others, the frost clinging to her sleeves, and she walked to the edge of the ridge where she could see the valley stretch wide and endless below. There, she whispered words no one heard, promises to the earth itself that she would endure another day. She thought of her family far behind the front lines, of the little house with its crooked roof and the garden that never grew straight rows of vegetables no matter how carefully they were planted. She thought of laughter echoing in kitchens, of the scent of bread, of the warmth of hands that had long since faded from reach. She carried those memories like hidden armor, invisible but stronger than steel. They reminded her why she remained, why she bent her back under the weight of duty even when her presence seemed so small against the scale of war. The days blurred into each other, and she measured time not by calendars but by the patterns of noise, the crack of rifles at dawn, the lull of silence at midday, the restless murmurs of night. She learned to count seconds between artillery bursts, to recognize distant echoes that signaled movement far down the slopes. Her ears became her weapon, sharper than any blade, attuned to danger before others noticed it. But still, she never thought herself capable of changing anything. She was a witness, nothing more. She carried bandages to men bleeding into the soil, she poured water into trembling hands, she steadied the weak, and she thought that was all she would ever be. The war was too vast, the ridge too merciless, and she was just one small figure among many. Yet the ridge was a place of cruel surprises. One morning, as the mist still clung to the ground and the sun rose sluggishly behind a curtain of smoke, she felt a stillness unlike any before. The air was too sharp, the silence too deliberate. The soldiers stirred uneasily, their laughter muted, their hands fidgeting with straps and buckles. She tightened her satchel and moved quietly among them, sensing that something hovered just out of sight, waiting to strike. It was then that she realized how deeply the ridge had taught her to feel danger, how her pulse could match the rhythm of an unseen drumbeat announcing change. She caught herself staring at the valley, eyes searching the shadows, though she did not know what she was searching for. And then it happened. The bullet came without warning, slicing the silence apart like a blade through fabric. It struck not far from her, the sound so sharp it rattled her bones. For a heartbeat the ridge froze, every face turning toward the echo, every hand reaching instinctively for steel. She felt her own breath seize in her throat, her mind blank with shock, but deep inside she knew in that instant that nothing would remain the same. The bullet had not touched her flesh, yet it tore through the fragile fabric of her role, ripping her from the background and thrusting her into the story she had tried so long to avoid. It was the first crack in the world she had built around herself, the moment when the ridge decided she could no longer hide behind her satchel in silence. The ridge erupted after that single shot, as if the earth itself had been waiting for the signal, men diving for cover, rifles rising like instinct, shouts tearing the silence into fragments, and she stood in the middle of it all with her satchel clutched tight against her chest, her eyes wide, her ears filled with the chaos that had followed the sharp crack of the rifle. She had always told herself she was invisible, that the bullets flying across the ridge were not meant for her, but in that instant she realized invisibility was only a fragile dream, because war did not care who carried rifles and who carried water, war simply chose its victims at random, and the sound of that single shot had proven that her place among the living was as uncertain as anyone else's. She stumbled forward, her breath heavy, her body moving on instinct toward the nearest soldier who had dropped to the ground clutching his shoulder, blood seeping fast through his jacket. She fell beside him without hesitation, hands pulling open her satchel, gauze already in her fingers, the roar of returning fire echoing around her as she pressed hard against the wound, whispering to him to hold on, to stay awake, to breathe through the pain, though she could barely hear her own words over the storm of gunfire that had descended. Her hands shook but did not falter, every second demanding choices she had never thought herself brave enough to make, yet her body moved with a certainty born from all the quiet nights of preparation, all the hours she had spent rehearsing in silence how she would dress wounds, how she would pour water into parched mouths, how she would shield men from the wind while they lay broken. Around her the ridge became a battlefield alive with smoke and dust, the shouts of commanders trying to restore order, the desperate scramble of soldiers finding positions to return fire down into the valley where the enemy had revealed themselves. She did not see faces, only shapes moving through haze, and she felt the ridge beneath her knees trembling as if the earth itself was groaning under the weight of the violence unleashed. When the soldier beside her screamed, she tightened her pressure, gritting her teeth, knowing that his survival now depended on her refusal to let fear control her. And for the first time she understood that being just support meant carrying lives in her hands, that her choices in that moment could mean the difference between breath and silence. When more bodies were dragged toward her, she realized she could no longer think of herself as separate from the battle. Blood stained her sleeves, soaking into the cloth until it was no longer hers, and she crawled from one soldier to another, tearing strips of fabric, tying makeshift bandages, holding head steady against the rocky ground. Her mind became a blur of instructions. Check the pulse, stop the bleeding, keep them conscious. And through it all the ridge continued to thunder with the endless trade of bullets. She had once believed that her satchel held only scraps and fragments, tools too small to matter in the face of artillery, but now every scrap became salvation, every fragment a lifeline, and the weight of the satchel was no longer trivial but monumental, heavier than any rifle could ever be. She moved like a shadow across the battlefield, not fighting but still at war, her breath ragged, her body trembling, her spirit stretched thin but unbroken. In the chaos she caught glimpses of things that seared themselves into her memory. A soldier's hand reaching out blindly for help and finding only the empty air, another gripping a letter stained with dirt as if words from home could shield him from the bullets, the commander's eyes flashing with desperate fury as he barked orders no one could fully hear. Each sight etched itself into her like scars that no bandage could ever mend. She realized how war had no interest in fairness, no patience for dreams, no mercy for hesitation. And yet she also realized that within that brutality lived moments of extraordinary resilience. She saw soldiers who had been strangers moments before dragging each other to safety, shielding one another with their own bodies, fighting not only for survival but for the person next to them. It was in those moments she understood that her place on the ridge had never been meaningless, that her presence, though quiet, had always been part of the fragile thread that bound them together. As the hours dragged on, the initial chaos hardened into grim endurance. The ridge became smoke and fire, the once still air now saturated with the acrid stench of gunpowder, the metallic tang of blood, the cries of men half lost to pain. She moved tirelessly, her body aching, her knees bruised from crawling across the jagged rocks, but she did not stop. The satchel grew lighter as she emptied it of its contents, until she was left improvising with strips torn from her own clothing, her own scarf pressed against wounds too deep to close. She thought of her family again, of that crooked-roofed house and the stubborn garden, and in her mind she spoke to them, promising she would return, promising she would not let the ridge claim her. It was a promise whispered into the storm, fragile and desperate, yet it gave her strength to push her shaking hands into yet another task, to give yet another soldier a chance to live. And then she heard it, a sound that froze her heart more than the first bullet had, the whistle of artillery screaming through the air, the thunder of impact as the ground shook violently beneath her. The enemy had brought heavier fire, determined to break the ridge once and for all. The blast threw her forward, rocks pelting her body, her ears ringing, her vision swimming with dust and light. She forced herself up, coughing, staggering, searching for the wounded she had been tending just moments before. The soldier she had pressed bandages to was gone, lost in the crater the explosion had torn into the earth, and she felt her stomach twist with grief so sharp it nearly stole her breath. But grief was a luxury the ridge would not allow. She stumbled forward, dragging another survivor from the smoke, her body screaming in protest but her mind refusing to yield. The ridge had demanded her transformation, and she could feel it happening with every breath, every heartbeat. She was no longer invisible, no longer the ghost drifting quietly among the soldiers. Her hands were red, her face streaked with ash and sweat, her eyes burning not only from the smoke but from a new fire within her, a fire that told her she could not retreat into silence anymore. She thought of that single bullet that had shattered her illusion of safety, and she understood now that it had not been just a random shot. It had been a summons, a call pulling her into the heart of the story she had tried to avoid. She was no longer standing at the edge of history. She was within it, shaping it, her actions as vital as any rifle shot, her determination as sharp as any blade. And as the ridge continued to burn beneath the weight of war, she whispered to herself, not as a prayer but as a vow, that she would not let the ridge break her, that she would carry every soul she could, that she would endure, no matter what the storm demanded. The ridge did not rest even after the first waves of battle subsided, for the smoke lingered in the air like a shroud and the bodies on the ground reminded everyone that the fight was far from over, and she moved among them with aching muscles and a mind sharpened by necessity, dragging the wounded into the shadows of the rocks, whispering promises she was not sure she could keep, her own heart thundering louder than the rifles still cracking in the distance. She had become something she had never imagined, a figure others looked for when pain tore through them, a presence that meant survival when everything else spoke only of death. Soldiers who had once barely noticed her now called out her name in desperate tones, reaching for her as though her hands were capable of pulling them back from the abyss, and each time she answered that call she felt a strange fire burning inside her, the heavy weight of responsibility pressing into her chest but also the fierce determination that she would not let the ridge decide alone who lived and who died. She realized then that she no longer moved simply with fear, she moved with purpose, and that purpose made her stride steady even as the world trembled. When the commanders gathered to plan their next move, she lingered close enough to hear though no one invited her into their circle, her eyes tracing the lines drawn in dirt with sticks, their voices low and urgent as they spoke of supply lines, reinforcements, and the relentless enemy pressing up from the valley. She listened not as an outsider but as someone who knew that the shape of those lines determined not just battles but the lives she would be asked to save. The ridge was not simply a patch of land anymore, it was a lifeline that both sides fought to control, and in its rocky soil lay the fate of everyone clinging to its edge. She thought about how fragile their hold truly was, and for the first time she felt anger rising in her, not just at the enemy beyond the ridge but at the idea that her life, their lives, could be measured and gambled like pieces on a board. That anger steadied her, hardened her, and she vowed silently that she would not be just a piece moved by others. She would carve her own place on the ridge, no matter how impossible that sounded. The next attack came with the suddenness of a storm, enemy figures rising through the mist of the valley, their silhouettes sharp against the dull gray of dawn, and once again the ridge exploded with noise and fire. She was ready this time. Her satchel had been restocked with whatever scraps she could gather, but she had also armed herself with something new. A shard of steel she had taken from a wrecked crate, not quite a weapon but sharp enough to matter if the fight came too close. She still told herself she was not a fighter, but survival had taught her that sometimes the line between roles could not be held forever. The soldiers roared their defiance, rifles blazing, and she crouched low behind a ridge of stone, rushing forward whenever someone fell, her fingers steady as she pressed cloth to wounds, poured water into cracked lips, and whispered fierce commands that they must not give up. Her voice, once soft and almost invisible, carried strength now, enough that the men who heard it obeyed, clinging to her words as they clung to life. Amid the chaos she saw a boy no older than 16 clutching a rifle too heavy for his thin arms, his face streaked with fear and dirt as he fired blindly into the valley. When the recoil knocked him back and the enemy fire sent him sprawling, she threw herself toward him, dragging him behind cover as bullets chipped stone around them. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wide, but she pressed a hand to his chest and told him firmly that he would not die here, not on this ridge, not under her watch. She bandaged his arm where the bullet had grazed him, her own body shielding his as the battle raged, and in that moment she felt not just like a healer but like a shield itself, standing between the young and the death that wanted to claim them. When he gripped her wrist with desperate strength, whispering thank you through chattering teeth, she realized that courage was not always about charging into battle but sometimes about refusing to let others fall when the world demanded they should. Hours bled into hours, the ridge consumed by endless fire, and she lost count of how many times she crawled across the rocks, how many hands she held, how many cries she answered. The fear was still there, coiled tight in her chest, but it no longer controlled her. She had learned to use it, to let it sharpen her senses, to let it remind her of the cost of every hesitation. And through it all, she began to notice something she had never seen before. The soldiers looking at her not as background but as part of them, nodding to her with respect, calling her name with trust rather than desperation. Even the commanders, too busy to waste words, gave her brief glances that carried acknowledgement, silent recognition that she had become more than she had been. The ridge itself seemed to know it too, the wind carrying her movements as if the land had accepted her place in its struggle. But the ridge demanded more with each passing day, testing the limits of her body and spirit. Supplies ran thin, water scarce, and every bandage she tied meant one fewer for the next wound. She scavenged whatever she could, cutting strips from fallen uniforms, boiling water over small fires hidden in the rocks, crushing herbs into poultices the way her grandmother once had in the quiet fields far away. She remembered lessons she had thought useless, the old remedies passed down in whispers, and now those whispers became her weapons, keeping men alive when everything else failed. She was no longer only support, she was invention, resilience, and defiance carved into flesh and stone. Yet each night, when the ridge grew quiet, she allowed herself a single moment to sit in the shadows, her hands shaking, tears falling silently as she thought of the ones she could not save. She buried their names deep in her memory, carrying them as part of her burden, refusing to let them vanish into the cold silence of forgotten war. One evening, after a particularly brutal skirmish, she found herself staring at the horizon where the sun bled red into the mountains, and she felt something shift within her. She realized she was no longer the same woman who had arrived on the ridge, invisible and quiet. She was forged now by fire and blood, shaped into someone who could not be ignored, someone who carried the weight of others and still stood. She thought again of that first bullet, how it had shattered her illusion of safety, and she understood now that it had also given her a choice, to fade or to rise. And she had risen, not with a rifle in her hands but with a strength that no bullet could silence. As night fell and the ridge prepared for whatever came next, she whispered into the wind that she was ready, ready for whatever test the world had yet to throw upon her. For the ridge had changed her, and she would not turn back. The night on the ridge was never truly silent anymore, for even when the rifles paused and the artillery fell still there lingered the groans of the wounded, the muffled sobs of men who dreamed of home but awoke to darkness and cold stone, and she moved among them like a restless spirit, adjusting bandages, whispering encouragement, forcing water into cracked lips, her own body shaking with fatigue yet refusing to collapse because she knew that if she faltered then hope itself would falter with her. Sleep had become a forgotten luxury, food nothing more than stale crumbs rationed out sparingly, and her hands bore the raw cuts and burns of endless labor, but her eyes carried something fierce now, something that made even the most hardened soldiers look at her with a kind of reverence, as if she were more than flesh and bone, as if she were a living embodiment of the ridge itself, scarred, battered, but unyielding. She no longer thought of herself as invisible. The men called her, the one who holds us together, and though she never asked for such a title she carried it as solemnly as a crown. One dawn, when the mist still lay thick across the valley and the frost clung stubbornly to the stones, she sat briefly on a jagged rock, her satchel emptied once more, her body aching for rest she could not give it, when the boy she had saved days earlier approached her with his arm bound in cloth. He placed in her hand a small charm carved from wood, a simple piece of his past he had carried through the fire. His voice shook as he told her that it had once belonged to his sister, that he had planned to keep it for luck, but now he wanted her to have it because he believed she was the reason he was still alive. She tried to protest, to tell him he should keep it, but he pressed it firmly into her palm and walked away before she could argue further. She stared at that tiny charm, no larger than her thumb, and felt tears threaten her eyes, for it was not simply a token but a declaration that she had become more than a passerby in their struggle. She had become a pillar, a figure they leaned on as much as on their rifles. And though she had never asked for such weight, she accepted it silently, knowing that refusing would dishonor the trust they placed in her. The days that followed blurred into an endless battle of endurance, the enemy pressing relentlessly from below, the ridge shaking with each explosion, and supplies dwindling until desperation forced them to strip bullets from the fallen and boil water from muddy pools. She did not simply heal anymore. She learned to carry ammunition, to drag crates across the rocks, to shout warnings when she saw movement the others missed. Her eyes had become sharper, her instincts honed until she felt danger before it arrived. Once, while refilling canteens at a shallow pool hidden between boulders, she sensed a flicker of movement above, and without thinking she pulled 2 soldiers down with her just as a burst of fire shredded the stone where they had stood. Their gasps of shock turned to gratitude as they realized she had saved them, and she understood in that instant that the ridge had given her more than resilience. It had given her the ability to see patterns, to read the silent language of war in a way even seasoned fighters sometimes overlooked. She was not a commander, yet her warnings began to shape the rhythm of their survival, her voice cutting through chaos with certainty that others obeyed without hesitation. Still, the ridge demanded sacrifice. Each day claimed lives, and though she fought for everyone she could, too many slipped through her fingers. She carried their faces with her, etched deep into her memory, and each time she closed another's eyes she whispered their names so the ridge would not swallow them into silence. One evening, after a brutal clash that left the ground stained dark, she sat with a soldier whose breath rattled weakly in his chest. He grasped her hand and asked her not to let him die alone. She stayed with him until the end, her own tears falling silently as she whispered stories of home, painting images of fields and skies he would never see again. When his hand finally fell limp, she pressed her forehead to his and promised she would carry him with her always. It was not a promise she could break, for to her every death became part of her armor, each one fueling the fire that kept her standing even when her body screamed to collapse. Then came the night when the enemy launched their fiercest assault yet, a storm of artillery and gunfire that tore the ridge into fragments. The sky glowed red with fire, the air thick with smoke so dense it choked the lungs, and she found herself in the very heart of it, dragging the wounded into shallow trenches, shielding them with her body as debris rained down. At one point the ground shook so violently that she was thrown into the dirt, her head spinning, blood trickling from a cut across her temple. But when she saw a soldier crawling helplessly toward her with his legs shattered she forced herself up, pain forgotten, and pulled him onto her back. Step by agonizing step she carried him across the torn ridge, every muscle screaming, until she laid him down behind cover where others rushed to tend him. She collapsed beside him, her vision darkening, but even then she refused to close her eyes, whispering again and again that she would not let the ridge break her. The commanders who once had barely noticed her, now spoke her name with respect, calling her into hurried councils, asking for her insight on where the enemy might strike next. At first she hesitated, for she was no strategist, but she realized that her constant watchfulness had given her a perspective others lacked. She had memorized the rhythms of the valley, the way the enemy moved under certain skies, the pauses between their barrages. When she spoke of her observations the commanders listened, and when they followed her warnings they found themselves better prepared. She did not seek leadership, but leadership began to grow around her all the same, as if the ridge itself had decided she was meant to guide as well as heal. And though the weight of that responsibility pressed heavily upon her, she carried it with the same stubborn resilience she had carried her satchel from the very beginning. There were nights she wondered how much more she could endure. Her body was thinner now, her face gaunt, her eyes ringed with exhaustion, yet when she looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror she carried she no longer saw the quiet figure who had once thought herself invisible. She saw scars, yes, but also strength carved into her features, a determination that could not be hidden. She saw someone who had faced the storm and had not yielded, someone who had discovered a fire within herself she had never known existed. She touched the wooden charm still hanging from her neck and whispered to herself that she would survive, not for her own sake but for those who believed in her, for those who had given her their last words, for those who still clung to life and looked to her for hope. And as another dawn broke, painting the sky with the pale colors of survival, she stood once more at the edge of the ridge, her satchel slung across her shoulder, her body aching but her spirit unbroken. The valley below was quiet for now, too quiet, the kind of silence that carried promise and threat in equal measure. She knew the battle was far from over, that the ridge would demand more of her yet, but she no longer feared what was coming. She had learned that courage was not the absence of fear but the refusal to be ruled by it, and she had chosen her path, to stand, to heal, to fight in her own way, and to endure whatever the ridge hurled at her. For she was no longer just support, no longer just background. She had become part of the story carved into the stones, and the ridge would remember her. The quiet that followed the last assault was not peace but a cruel pause, the kind that weighed heavier than noise, a silence swollen with anticipation as if the world itself was holding its breath, and she felt it pressing down on her chest as she moved along the ridge, checking the wounded, replacing soaked bandages with fresh cloth, her hands moving automatically even as her eyes flicked constantly toward the valley below. The enemy had not retreated, she knew that. Much, for their absence felt like the coiling of a snake waiting to strike, and every soldier on the ridge sensed it too, their shoulders tense, their laughter forced, their movements sharp and restless. She had learned to read fear in the way men adjusted their rifles too often or chewed the insides of their cheeks until they bled, and she saw that fear everywhere now, not because they doubted their own strength but because they all understood that the ridge had become a cage, and cages always close tighter until something shattered. She tightened the strap of her satchel as though the weight of it could steady her heartbeat, whispering to herself that she had endured this long and would endure again, even if the ridge had more cruelty yet to show her. The commanders tried to project confidence, speaking of reinforcements on the way, of supplies that would arrive if they could just hold out a little longer, but she had grown wise to the cracks in their voices and the shadows in their eyes. She knew reinforcements were uncertain, supplies even more so, and that the only thing they truly had was each other and the stones beneath their feet. She began to notice how the men looked to her in the hours between orders, as if her simple presence grounded them in ways the maps and strategies could not. She did not pretend to be more than she was, but she forced herself to meet their eyes, to stand taller even when her body ached, to speak with firmness when she told them they would survive, because sometimes conviction mattered more than truth. When one of the youngest broke down in tears during the night, whispering that he wanted to go home, she sat beside him, cradled his trembling shoulders, and told him about her own memories of home, the crooked roof and stubborn garden, the laughter that refused to fade from her mind. She painted him a picture of survival not with maps but with human memory, and when he finally slept she realized that sometimes her greatest weapon was not her hands but her ability to remind them that life existed beyond the ridge. When the attack came it was worse than any before, a coordinated surge that battered the ridge from 3 sides at once, rifles blazing from the valley, mortars tearing the rocks apart, and shadows swarming upward through the smoke. The ridge roared with chaos, men screaming orders, bullets flying in every direction, the earth itself trembling beneath the violence. She threw herself into the storm without hesitation, not with a weapon but with her satchel, crawling across the rocks to reach the fallen, dragging bodies into cover, shouting above the gunfire for others to help her. She felt the heat of explosions sear her skin, the sting of debris slicing her arms, but she did not stop, for every second counted, every breath she could save another thread against the unraveling of their fragile hold on the ridge. At one point she found herself face to face with an enemy soldier who had broken through the line, his rifle raised, his eyes wide with the same fear she had seen in her own men. For a heartbeat time froze, the air between them heavy with death, but before he could pull the trigger one of her comrades struck him down, and she found herself trembling, her shard of steel clutched so tightly in her hand that her knuckles bled. She realized then how thin the line truly was between survival and silence, and how easily she could have been erased from the ridge in that instant. The fighting raged for hours, the ridge transformed into a furnace of smoke and fire, and she lost all sense of time as she moved from one broken body to another. Her voice grew hoarse from shouting, her hands numb from blood and cold, her knees raw from the stone, but still she did not yield. She poured every fragment of herself into the work, every memory of her family, every promise she had whispered to the dying, every ounce of defiance that had grown inside her since that first bullet. When at last the enemy was pushed back, when the valley below fell quiet again, she collapsed beside a cluster of wounded, her chest heaving, her vision blurred with exhaustion. The ridge was littered with the fallen, and she knew that many more had been lost than saved, but when the boy with the wooden charm limped to her side and whispered, "We're still here because of you," she forced herself to smile through her tears. Because she understood that survival itself was victory, however fragile, however fleeting. In the days that followed, she noticed how her presence had shifted further into something unspoken but undeniable. Men began to defer to her in moments of uncertainty, asking where to set their watch, when to move, how to brace the wounded, as if her instincts had become a compass they trusted more than orders from above. Even the commanders no longer looked past her but addressed her with careful respect, recognizing that the ridge itself seemed to answer to her in ways no maps or plans could capture. She did not seek their recognition, but she used it to press for what was needed: more care for the wounded, better rationing of supplies, stronger shelters against the artillery. And though the commanders rarely argued, she knew it was not her voice alone that swayed them but the silent force of the men who stood behind her, men who believed in her because she had never let them fall when she could stand instead. Still, the ridge was relentless. Food ran low, the cold grew harsher, and whispers spread of the enemy preparing something greater, something final. She felt the weight of those whispers like stones pressing on her chest, but she did not allow herself to show fear. Each morning she stood at the edge of the ridge, looking out over the valley, whispering to herself that she would not break, that she would not let the ridge decide her fate. And as the days passed, she began to feel a strange connection to the land itself, as though the stones and wind had claimed her as their own. She could sense the shifts in the air, the patterns in the enemy's movements, the rhythm of the silence before fire. She was no longer merely enduring the ridge, she was becoming part of it, carved into its story as surely as the scars etched into its rocks. One night, as she sat sharpening her shard of steel by the faint glow of a lantern, the boy with the wooden charm asked her if she had ever thought of leaving, of abandoning the ridge and fleeing into the darkness. She looked at him for a long time before answering, her voice steady though her heart ached. She told him that the ridge was not a place she could leave behind, for it had taken too much from her, given her too much, bound her too tightly to those who fought upon it. She said that even if her body left, her spirit would remain here, among the stones and the wind and the echoes of every cry she had answered. He stared at her with wide eyes, and for the first time she saw not only gratitude in his gaze but understanding, a recognition that she had crossed a threshold no one else could fully grasp. And when he finally nodded and whispered, "Then I'll stay too," she felt both pride and sorrow, for she knew the ridge would demand more from him as it had from her. As the cold deepened and the nights grew longer, she carried that knowledge with her, that the ridge was not done with her, not yet. She touched the wooden charm at her neck, pressed her hand to the satchel that had never left her side and whispered into the dark that no matter what came she would endure, because the ridge had transformed her from shadow into flame, and flames did not fade quietly. The winter came early to the ridge, sweeping across the barren stones with winds so sharp they cut through fabric and flesh alike, and she felt its bite in every breath she took, the cold settling into her bones until it seemed her very blood had slowed, yet she refused to let it steal her strength, wrapping strips of torn cloth around her hands and pressing forward through the frozen nights as if the chill were only another enemy to defy. The soldiers huddled closer together now, their bodies thinner, their eyes sunken, but still they looked to her, and she moved among them with the same quiet determination she had carried since the first bullet had shattered her illusion of safety, offering them warmth not in blankets but in words, telling them stories of sunlit fields and roaring fires, memories that flickered through the darkness like torches against the endless cold. She knew that each word mattered, that each whisper of hope was another shield against despair, and though she often felt her own spirit tremble she never allowed them to see it, for their belief in her had become as vital as food or water. The enemy had not vanished, their presence lingered in the valley below like wolves circling prey, waiting for the moment when hunger and frost would weaken the defenders enough to break them. Scouts reported movements in the night, shadows slipping between the trees, the distant thud of preparations being laid, and everyone knew that a storm was coming, greater than any they had faced before. She could feel it too, in the heaviness of the air, in the way the silence pressed tighter each day, as though the ridge itself was bracing for impact. She kept her satchel ready at all times, its contents reshaped daily by necessity. Scraps of cloth, herbs crushed into poultices, the last of the bandages scavenged from fallen comrades. She carried the wooden charm at her neck as if it were armor, her fingers brushing it whenever doubt threatened to consume her, whispering silently to the boy's unseen sister that she would keep fighting for him, for all of them, until the ridge itself fell away beneath her feet. The commanders called meetings more frequently now, their voices tight with urgency, and though she still was not part of their official circle, she found herself drawn to their maps, their hurried debates, the lines of worry etched into their faces. Once, when they argued over where to place their remaining strength, she stepped forward and spoke, her voice steady though her heart raced, pointing out the pattern she had seen in the enemy's probing attacks, the way their fire shifted subtly before each advance, the rhythm she had tracked for weeks in the silences between barrages. At first the commanders stared at her as if surprised she had spoken, but then they listened, truly listened, and when they followed her warning the next day and caught the enemy before they could climb the slope, she saw respect settle into their eyes. They did not name her a leader, but she no longer needed the title, for the ridge itself had named her in the trust of every man and woman who looked her way when the ground shook beneath their feet. But trust could not stop the hunger, nor mend the wounds that never fully healed. She watched as men wasted away, their cheeks hollow, their hands trembling from cold and weakness, and she knew the ridge was bleeding them slowly even without bullets. She forced herself to take less food so others might have more, ignoring the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, telling herself that strength was not only measured in flesh but in will. At night she lay awake, staring at the sky where the stars burned cold and distant, wondering if anyone beyond this ridge still remembered them, if the world continued to spin in laughter and light while they fought and froze in shadows. Sometimes despair whispered to her, telling her that all of this was meaningless, that the ridge was nothing but a graveyard waiting to claim them, but each time she pushed the thought away, gripping the wooden charm until its edges cut into her palm, whispering that meaning was what they made of it, that survival itself was meaning enough. The boy with the wounded arm stayed close to her now, shadowing her movements, carrying water, fetching supplies, his eyes watching her with fierce determination. She saw in him the reflection of herself, the transformation that the ridge demanded, and though it pained her to see his youth stolen so quickly, she also felt pride in the strength he had found. One night he told her that the others spoke of her as if she were more than human, as if she were a spirit that walked among them, keeping them alive through sheer will. She shook her head at his words, telling him she was nothing more than a woman who refused to give up, but inside she wondered if perhaps the ridge had changed her into something beyond what she had ever been. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but a flame lit by the countless souls who had burned out upon these stones, a flame that refused to die even as the wind howled and the cold pressed down. Then came the day when the storm finally broke. It began with a distant rumble, not thunder but the rolling of artillery being dragged into place, and every soldier on the ridge froze, listening, waiting. The air thickened with dread as the sound grew louder, closer, until the first shells screamed through the sky and exploded across the stones, tearing earth and bodies alike into fragments. The ridge shook with each impact, smoke rising in choking clouds, the cries of the wounded lost beneath the roar. She threw herself into the chaos once more, dragging men from craters, pressing cloth to wounds that poured faster than her hands could stop, shouting for others to help even as her own body was hurled to the ground by another blast. She rose each time, staggering, coughing, blood running down her arms, refusing to yield because she knew that if she stopped even for a moment the ridge would devour them all. The enemy advanced in waves, shadows climbing through the smoke, rifles blazing, their voices shouting through the din, and the defenders met them with desperate fire, their cries mingling with the thunder. She crawled across the battlefield like a creature born of stone and ash, her satchel nearly empty, her body raw with exhaustion, but still she pressed forward, holding hands that trembled on the edge of death, whispering that they were not alone, that she would not let them slip into silence without a fight. She felt bullets whip past her, felt the ground shatter beneath her knees, but each time she rose again, driven not by hope of victory but by the simple refusal to let despair claim them. She became motion itself, a blur of blood and will, and in the eyes of those she saved she saw the reflection of something unbreakable, something the ridge itself seemed to acknowledge. When night finally fell the ridge was littered with bodies, the smoke heavy, the cries quieter now, but they had not broken. Against all odds they had held the line, though at a terrible cost. She sat among the wounded, her hands trembling too violently to hold another bandage, her body covered in ash and blood that was not her own, her eyes staring into the fire they had lit against the cold. The boy with the charm sat beside her, his face pale, his body shaking, but his eyes burned with the same fire she felt inside. Neither spoke for a long time, the silence heavy, broken only by the crackle of the flames. At last he whispered, "We're still here," and she nodded slowly, clutching the wooden charm against her chest, whispering to herself that they would remain here as long as the ridge demanded, as long as there was breath left to give. The ridge seemed quieter after the great assault, But it was not the quiet of peace, it was the eerie stillness of a battlefield holding its breath, a silence filled with smoke and ash and the faint moans of the wounded, and as she moved among the bodies she felt that silence cling to her skin like frost. She had seen men broken in countless ways, had pressed her hands into wounds that would never close, but this silence weighed heavier than the blood, heavier even than the grief, because it whispered that the ridge had not finished with them, that the enemy's absence was only the shadow of something darker yet to come. The men huddled closer to her than ever, their eyes hollow but fixed on her movements as though the simple act of her standing, of her refusing to collapse, was enough to hold the world together a little longer. She carried that responsibility like a stone on her back, not resenting it but understanding it, for the ridge had chosen her the moment that first bullet tore away the illusion that she was only support. Her body bore the marks of all she had endured, bruises that never faded, cuts that reopened with each movement, her voice hoarse from days without rest, yet she kept moving because movement was life and stillness meant surrender. She found herself sleeping less, her eyes snapping open at the slightest sound, her ears attuned to the rhythm of distant gunfire, the shuffle of boots on stone, the hiss of the wind that seemed to carry warnings in its cold breath. She began to think of herself as part of the ridge itself, carved from its stones, hardened by its storms, her veins flowing with the same stubborn endurance that held the rocks against the constant assault. At night she would sit with the boy who clung to the wooden charm, speaking softly about nothing at all, about birds she remembered, about rivers she had once touched, just to remind him that there was a world beyond this place. In those moments she could almost feel warmth again, not from fire or blankets but from the stubborn bond they shared, a defiance stronger than bullets or frost. Yet the commanders whispered of the enemy regrouping, of a final offensive being prepared in the valley below, and the men felt it too, a tension that crawled beneath their skin, keeping them restless, sharpening their eyes as if waiting for a storm to tear open the sky. She walked among them, pressing cloth into trembling hands, speaking of survival with the same steady conviction she had used since the beginning, even though inside she could feel the shadow pressing heavier each day. She knew the ridge would not let them rest, that the enemy would return in greater force, and she wondered if she herself had the strength left to endure once more. But each time the thought rose, she crushed it with the memory of every life she had saved, every whisper of gratitude, every hand that had clutched hers as though she were the last anchor against the abyss. She told herself that even if her body broke, she would not let her spirit falter, because the ridge demanded not only flesh but defiance, and defiance she still had in abundance. Food became scarcer, the rations shrinking to crumbs, and she gave away most of what she received to the younger ones, telling them she wasn't hungry, though her stomach ached and her knees weakened when she stood. The boy noticed, of course, his sharp eyes catching the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was looking, and one night he pressed half of his own portion into her hand without a word. She wanted to refuse, to insist he needed it more, but the fire in his eyes stopped her, and she accepted, eating slowly, letting the warmth of the food seep into her weary body as though it were more than nourishment, as though it were a piece of his will shared with her. She realized then that the ridge was no longer shaping only her but shaping all of them, binding them together in a chain of sacrifice and stubbornness that no storm could break. They had become not just soldiers, not just survivors, but fragments of one unyielding whole, a living embodiment of the ridge's refusal to fall. The nights grew colder still, the wind sharper, and sometimes she thought she could hear voices in it, the echoes of the fallen calling out from the stones. She did not fear them, for their presence felt less like a haunting and more like a reminder that she was not alone, that countless others had poured their lives into this place and that she now carried their fire within her. When she closed her eyes she saw their faces, some clear, some blurred by smoke, but all etched into her memory as if the ridge itself had carved them there. She whispered their names when she bandaged wounds, whispered their promises when she dragged the wounded into cover, whispering always so the silence would not consume her. And when the boy asked her once why she spoke to no one, she told him that the ridge listened, that the stones remembered, and that if they gave their voices to the ridge then they would never truly vanish. He nodded solemnly, clutching his charm, and from that night she heard his voice too, murmuring softly into the wind as if adding his own thread to the endless tapestry of survival. One dawn the scouts returned with confirmation. The enemy was preparing for a strike unlike any before, massing their strength with the clear intention of crushing the ridge in one final blow. The news spread quickly, carried on hushed voices, heavy footsteps, the tightening of grips around rifles. Fear settled over the camp like a shroud, but she walked through it with her chin raised, her voice steady as she told them they would endure, that they had faced the storm before and would do so again. She knew the odds were against them, that the enemy had numbers and supplies they could not match, But she also knew that survival was not measured by numbers but by will, and their will had outlasted every attempt to break it so far. She gathered the wounded, preparing what little she had left, her satchel lighter than ever before, and whispered to herself that it would be enough, that she would make it enough. The boy sat with her as night fell, his face lit by the dim glow of the fire, his charm clutched tightly in his hands. He asked her if she was afraid, and for a moment she wanted to lie, to tell him she felt nothing but certainty, but the ridge had taught her that truth carried its own strength. She told him that yes, she was afraid, that fear was what reminded her she was still alive, but that fear did not own her, it only sharpened her resolve. She told him that courage was not the absence of fear but the refusal to let fear decide, and he listened in silence, his eyes wide, his breathing slow, and when she finished he nodded, as if he had carved those words into himself as firmly as the ridge carved itself into all of them. She felt then that she had passed something on to him, not just survival, but a piece of her own fire, and she knew that no matter what the ridge demanded next, that fire would burn on. When the first distant rumble of artillery began again, rolling like thunder across the valley, she closed her eyes and drew a long breath, steadying herself against the cold stone at her back. She whispered to the wind, to the fallen, to the ridge itself, that she was ready. And as the soldiers took their positions, as rifles were loaded and eyes sharpened against the dark, she stood among them not as a shadow, not as support, but as the unyielding flame that the ridge itself had forged. The ridge did not sleep that night, every man and woman awake with eyes wide, waiting for the storm that had been promised, and though the cold gnawed at their bones no one dared close their eyes for fear that the silence might be shattered without warning. She sat with her back to a jagged rock, the wooden charm pressed against her chest, her satchel already packed with the last scraps of bandages and herbs, her hands steady though her heart beat like a drum inside her ribs. The boy sat beside her, his face pale but his jaw set, and she saw in him the reflection of what the ridge had done to all of them, carved away the softness of youth and replaced it with iron. When the first scream of artillery split the sky at dawn she rose without hesitation, the stone beneath her boots trembling, the air filling with smoke and dust, and she whispered to herself that she would not break, not now, not when the ridge demanded everything. The barrage tore across the stones, earth and bodies hurled into the air as if the ridge itself were being unmade, and she threw herself into the chaos without thought, dragging the wounded from craters, pressing rags against blood that poured faster than her hands could stop, shouting above the thunder for others to hold the line. The enemy surged upward in waves, their silhouettes black against the smoke, rifles flashing, voices roaring, and the defenders met them with a fury born of desperation, steel and fire colliding in a storm that swallowed the ridge whole. She became movement itself, crawling, running, stumbling, rising again, her body battered but her will unbroken, refusing to yield even as the sky rained death upon them. She heard men cry out for mothers, for brothers, for God, and each time she pressed her hands against their wounds she whispered that they were not alone, that she would not let them vanish into silence. Her words carried on the roar of battle like fragile threads of defiance. Hours blurred into each other, the sun hidden behind smoke, time measured only in screams and gunfire, until she no longer knew if it was morning or night. She felt her strength waning, her body trembling with exhaustion, her satchel nearly empty, but she forced herself onward because to stop was to surrender and surrender was death. The boy fought near her, his rifle clutched with both hands, his face streaked with ash and tears, and when she saw him stumble she rushed to his side, dragging him into cover, pressing her own body against the stone to shield him from the storm. He looked at her with wide, terrified eyes, and she whispered that he must keep fighting, not for victory but for survival, for the chance to carry the fire beyond the ridge. He nodded, clutching his charm tighter, and she rose again, stepping into the smoke as if the ridge itself had pushed her forward. It was then that the moment came, sudden and sharp, as inevitable as the dawn. She was kneeling beside a soldier with his chest torn open, her hands slick with blood, when the crack of a rifle echoed above the din and a bullet tore into her shoulder, spinning her backward against the rock. The pain was white-hot, searing through her body like fire, but what struck her harder was the realization that this was the moment she had always known would come, the moment when the ridge demanded its price from her. The boy screamed her name, crawling toward her, but she raised her uninjured hand and shouted for him to stay back, her voice stronger than she felt, because she would not let him break for her. She pressed her palm against the wound, blood soaking through her fingers, and forced herself to rise again, staggering but unyielding, because one bullet might change everything but it would not end her will. The men saw her rise, saw her bloodied but still moving, and a roar spread through them, louder than the gunfire, a surge of defiance that pushed them forward. She became their banner, not of cloth but of flesh and fire, and they rallied around her, their rifles steady, their eyes burning with a fury that no enemy could extinguish. She felt her strength slipping with every step, her vision blurring, but she poured herself into each movement, each word, each touch, knowing that even if her body fell, her spirit had already taken root in them all. She dragged another wounded man to safety, pressed her last scrap of cloth into a gaping wound, whispered her final promise into his ear, and when he clutched her hand with tears in his eyes, she felt the ridge itself tremble with her. The battle raged on, the enemy relentless, but the defenders refused to yield, their will hardened by her unbreakable presence, their fury sharpened by the sight of her standing bloodied but unbroken. She no longer felt the cold, no longer heard the roar of artillery, only the pounding of her own heart and the fire that refused to fade. She thought of the home she had left behind, the crooked roof and stubborn garden, the laughter that had once filled her days, and she realized that she carried it still, here on the ridge, in every life she touched, in every breath she saved. She thought of the fallen whose name she had whispered into the wind, and she felt them beside her now, their voices in the smoke, their hands steadying her steps. She thought of the boy and his wooden charm, of the fire in his eyes, and she knew that even if her body did not leave the ridge, her flame would carry on through him and through all of them. As the sun finally broke through the smoke, weak and red against the horizon, the enemy faltered, their waves broken against the unyielding stone, their voices fading into retreat. The ridge stood, battered but unbroken, its defenders bloodied but alive, and in that moment she felt both triumph and sorrow, for the cost was written all around her in the still bodies, in the silence that returned heavier than before. She collapsed at last, her knees giving way, her vision dimming, the bullet's fire still burning inside her, and the boy caught her before she struck the ground, his hands trembling as he whispered that she could not leave him, that they still needed her. She touched his cheek with blood-stained fingers, her voice a ragged whisper as she told him that he was ready, that they all were ready, because the ridge had forged them as it had forged her. She pressed the wooden charm back into his hands, curling his fingers around it, and told him never to let the fire die. Her eyes closed then, not in surrender but in peace, the ridge beneath her no longer a prison but a part of her, her spirit woven into its stones, its winds, its silence. The boy held her, tears streaking his face, but when the others gathered around they did not weep alone, for they felt her presence still, burning in their hearts, steadying their hands, whispering in the wind that swept across the ridge. One bullet had changed everything, not by ending her but by transforming her, by taking the woman who had once been only support and making her eternal, a flame that would never fade, a spirit that would walk the ridge for as long as it stood. And as the defenders rose once more, lifting their rifles against the horizon, they did so with her fire in their veins, their voices rising in defiance, their hearts unyielding, because she had shown them that survival was not only possible but inevitable when one refused to break. The end.